The Aurora Forum is presented by Stanford Lively Arts and the Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts, and is co-sponsored by the Office of the President and Provost and Stanford's Office of Public Affairs. We're here for another conversation in our series with artists visiting campus, presented by Stanford Lively Arts. Tonight's conversation is called Hip Hop, the Spirit of an Arts Movement. And our guests tonight are Lorenzo Rennie Harris and Harry Elam Jr. Before I properly introduce our guests, I want to thank the staff at Stanford Lively Arts, the Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts, and the Office of the President and Provost for their ongoing support of the Aurora Forum. So let me begin by introducing a man who on this campus really needs no introduction, Professor Harry Elam Jr., who is the Olive H. Palmer Professor in the Humanities, the Robert and Ruth Halperin University Fellow for Undergraduate Education, Director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts, Director of the Committee on Black Performing Arts, and the University Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. And indeed, tonight we're going to be talking about education because both of our guests here tonight are educators who have been refining their craft for many, many years. Professor Elam was educated at Harvard and UC Berkeley, where he received a PhD degree in 1984, and his scholarly work focuses on contemporary American drama, particularly African American and Chicano theater. In addition to his scholarly work, he has directed theater professionally for more than 18 years. Most notably, he has directed several of August Wilson's plays. He is the author of Taking It to the Streets, the social protest theater of Louis Valdez and Amiri Baraka, and is the co-editor of 4 books on theatrical arts, in addition to many other publications. He's the winner of multiple teaching awards at Stanford, and he has received the Betty Jones Award for Outstanding Teaching from the American Theater and Drama Society in 2006, which was the same year he was inducted into the College of Fellows of the American Theater. He has taught at Stanford since 1990 and is the former director of the Introduction to the Humanities program. So Professor Elam has, I think, more knowledge and experience in depth with the ongoing trajectory of humanistic education at Stanford than anyone else I could imagine. His younger brother, Keith, an artist known by his stage name Guru, a backronym for Gifted Unlimited Rhymes Universal, died early last year, and I hope we'll spend time this evening talking about his life and his work. So our guest tonight from Philadelphia is, as I said before, Lorenzo Rennie Harris, who at the age of 47 has earned recognition as one of hip-hop's leading ambassadors. In Philadelphia, he has been voted one of the most influential citizens of that city in the course of the past 100 years, and I recently ran into some students from Philadelphia, and I said, do you know about Rennie Harris? Oh yeah, everybody knows about Rennie Harris. He's been compared to 20th century dance legends Alvin Ailey and Bob Fosse, and his list of honors is too long for me to recite them all here. He has received 3 Bessie Awards, an Alvin Ailey Black Choreographers Award, the coveted Philadelphia Rocky Prize. I have to find out about that. And was nominated for a Sir Laurence Olivier Award in the UK. And just this past year, he received an honorary doctorate of fine arts from Bates College and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Now, as we will learn in the conversation tonight, Rennie Harris's approach to his art is rooted in a deep humanitarian vision that we will not overcome racial or ethnic barriers until we know, appreciate, and respect the particular and distinct cultural worlds from which each of us come. Dr. Harris has devoted his life to bringing hip-hop dance to all people in the belief that it expresses universal themes that transcend boundaries of race, religion, gender, and economic status, and boundaries that it transcends boundaries that affect the generations. And this is something I think we're going to be particularly interested in tonight. For his work encompasses the diverse and rich traditions of the past, while simultaneously presenting the voice of a new generation through its ever-evolving interpretation of what it means to dance. In founding the Rennie Harris Pure Movement Dance Company, which will perform here this Saturday afternoon at 3 and in the evening at 8, he embarked on the journey to excavate the global connections inherent in hip-hop as an American vernacular art movement. This quest has resulted in a body of work, an original, highly original body of work that embraces the idea that what we share is greater than all those things that we think might keep us apart. So please join me in welcoming our two guests to the Aurora Forum stage. I think a good place to begin, Rennie, is here you are. You're an artist at residence at Stanford this winter, and you're teaching a course called Dance 121. What's that about?
It's a course on what I call a day before hip hop, where we the history. Well, part is partly lecture and part technique, and so half of the class is a lecture on hip hop, the connection between hip hop and traditional African culture, and its lineage throughout, since we've been here in the Americas. So, for instance, the very moment that we become slaves, the first question I asked the class was slavery the beginning of Black contemporary expression? And so we begin to have this sort of dialogue and sort of either debate or just kind of open it up and talk about, the effect that slavery had, its negatives and positives as well, but also then begin to challenge the beginning of what is tradition, and tradition having to sort of meet this sort of contemporary means, sort of, so for instance, the African traditional rhythm now is being played on a tea kettle on the slave ship. So that changes the sound of what is tradition, and so does this become contemporary expression? But, I mean, in some way. So these are the questions. This is where we start from, and we sort of build from there. And hopefully we move all the way up to today. Basically, I'm squeezing 9 months into 10 weeks.
And hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So how does that translate into the movement they do in terms of the class?
So the movement, the movement that I'm teaching them is a style called house, which is it falls under the hip hop umbrella, and this house movement is really based on rhythms. And so this sort of percussive understanding of rhythm, and the idea is that rhythm is what teaches us to how to move, or how to learn, which gives us our knowledge, iambic pentameter. This is how we learn as humans, through rhythm and these sounds. And so, through house, sort of kind of revisiting the idea of traditional culture, percussively, and as well as the dance.
So everybody has rhythm.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, it's just, if you feel like you don't have rhythms, because you've kind of convinced yourself that you don't.
Now, I mean,
or you've been convinced.
One of the things I think interesting about this class, and interesting about you as a performer, choreographer, is this connection of history to hip-hop, meaning that hip-hop comes from a place, and you're very, very interested in connecting it in terms of understanding it as a dance and as a movement.
I think one of the reasons why I was interested was because as a child, when I practitioner prior to it becoming hip hop. It becomes hip hop in 81, but you know, in the 70s we didn't. There was no name, you know. So I was younger, and I was following what the older guys were doing, you know. And so once it becomes, you know, it gets onto its path, you know, I think I heard so many negative things about, you know, what it wasn't. It's not real dance, and it would never. People told me you would never do anything with this, and you need to go to school, become a ballet dancer, go take jazz, and these things are gonna make you live longer, and blah blah blah. You know, and I remember feeling resentful, and again, as a young person, and we were talking about this backstage. It's like, you know, you're full of all this energy. all this emotion, and like you're just resisting, like, why are you going to tell a child that you will never succeed at dancing or doing this street dance or whatever, you know, and you know, it was sort of like it was a green flag for me to go, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you, and I'm going to tell you, point out its relevance and its connection to what you know, what you think, what you think you know. And so it was sort of, and so on some level, it was me, you know, wanting to get back at all the older people who thought that this was like, just, you know, I'm almost 50 years old and I'm a hip hop dancer. It's not a youth thing. That people, Pop Master Fable from the Rocksteady crew, and I may be misquoting him, but he once said that, you know, people confuse youth culture with urban culture, and there are two different things. You know, and so when he said that, I said, you know, you're absolutely right. And this has nothing to do, I mean, it has to do with youth culture today because it's continued being fed to youth. But it was just about expression from the gate. My generation, this was our voice. This was after Vietnam War. This was after the Black Panthers. This was the continuation of resistance in American culture, and in a way picking up the baton from the revolutionaries of that time. Because when African Mbata founded the Universal Zulu Nation, he said, I'm creating a cultural gang. Where you're going to learn about where you come from, your relevance, black, white, or indifferent, anyone who's in the ghetto, quote unquote, or who were poor, quote unquote, anyone who was involved in that and was in part of Zulu Nation, it didn't matter, you were part of that, and you were going to learn about your history in this country. And that was the beginning, to me, that really was the beginning of hip hop, and is the foundation of it. And we talked about the other day, the fifth element. But the fifth element, which of hip hop, really to me should be the first element, which is knowledge. You know, hip hop. The fifth
Can you
element
give the
knowledge.
elements for the audience?
So you know, according to African Mbata, who was the founder of the Zulu Nation, the longest running hip hop organization, an activist organization in the world, so to speak, he identified all the you know, the expressions, and he called them the four elements. And that was the MC, was the either microphone controller that we used to call it, or master of ceremonies, of course, the the person who makes all the announcements originally and may say a rhyme or two in the beginning. That was what an MC was. The dancer, which at that time they specifically said the B-boy or the B-girl, breaking. And then you had the graffiti artist, which was the visual arts. All right, and then you had the DJ, which was the music and musicianship. And so he coined the MC and DJ and dance and graffiti as the four elements of hip hop. And this is what makes up makes up hip hop. And then later he came out with the fifth element, and he understood that none of those things were relevant unless you had knowledge. And knowledge was is the most important element of hip-hop culture. Hence why there's always some sort of undertone message or encoded thing that they're saying, and most of the people don't have no clue what's being said on the airways unless it's extremely direct and vulgar, then it's an issue. But there was things that went on the air when we were kids that we couldn't believe they let get on the air because they didn't know what these guys was actually, what they were actually saying.
But that's about being hip, right? I mean, you knew.
Right,
other
we
people
knew,
didn't.
right, yeah. And so the idea was, again, the foundation is having this sort of like a resistance and like speaking on the radio and saying, hey, we're going to all meet over here and we're going to go march to so-and-so, but no one knew we were going to do it. We just knew it.
You know what it's like, too? It's a sense of what Henry Louis Gates calls double-voicedness, or you take it back to slavery, where you talked about, swing low, sweet chariot. Right. It was both a song saying to the master, but on the other hand, it's like we're going north. So that sense of a coded message and change,
which is
tradition,
right?
too,
Which is
history.
a connection to traditional African dance and culture, and we were just talking about this in class, where we talk about the gates that are the actual black iron gates that are around churches and people's businesses in the country, and at the points on these gates. Some of them come to a point this way, and some of them actually have an arrow's head on them. This was a message with the slaves nationally that they were going to rise up and that we're going to regain our freedom again. And so anytime you saw the arrow, you knew that there was a faction that was in that area that understood that we were going to basically rebel. And so this sort of connects this encoded message is very much the tradition.
So thinking about that, you mentioned a word that and Danny Haka, this guy who, in terms, you know him from hip hop theater, and defining hip hop theater, what he says is it's resistance. And when I think of hip hop, I think of another word related to it, in terms of its origin. When it was also, and you dancing on the street, it was about survival too, which relates. So how do those words work for you, resistance, survival, but then take it to now, and how do they figure in your work when you're doing it in a concert stage? Can it still be resistance? Is it still about survival?
The resisting and survival, the idea of that is just a sort of, I'm assuming we've all had this experience at some point in time, like, just on a very simple level, like you're just upset with your parents. Most of the time, us being upset is our parents. So you're just upset, or a family member. So you're just upset, and whatever your thing is that's where you're going to gravitate to. You're gonna go to, if you collect stamps, if you dance, if you move, if you just need to go play basketball or baseball, you're gonna move to that space. For us, it was the dance and it was hip hop. And so that was the resistance, and we would dance hard. We would go and just like, I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna show you, and we would just go. And what they called at one point, there was a slang called breaking. Now, this also is part of what contributed to the term, as we know it, breaking or break boy or break girl, b-boy, b-girl, or break dance, what the media called it, right? Breaking also meant, it was a slang, it was a euphemism for, I was upset. So for example, hey, Harry, what's going on, man? What's wrong with you? And he responds, yo, man, my mom was just breaking on me, man. I can't take it no more. Meaning she was just going off, she was upset. So a lot of guys, when some of the terminology, when they asked what they were doing on the street, when they were dancing or in the club, man, we breaking, we just getting off, we going off. That was one, I heard it personally, so I knew it was used. That was one take of it, so that this idea, this resistance, when you go out to the club and you hear that music, and the music is speaking to you and speaking to your soul, and the music is the only thing that really understands you. At that moment, that was the resistance for us. And the dance, and then on the other hand, the dance also was very celebratory. So there was always this positive and negative within hip hop. While hip hop artists could be very misogynistic in one album and then come back and say, lift your head up. Where, Tupac could say, look, Brenda, lift your head up. Because we, in the hip hop community, we understand the duality and how these things work. So in the commercial world, you get bombed for, that's you're not being PC, that's wrong, and blah, blah, blah. But what it is that they're not realizing that the very gangster, the person who's talking about being a gangster is also talking about educate yourself. And so they're playing, both sides of the fence in a way, and not sort of playing it being intentional about it in that way, but it's part of the culture to point out both sides all the time and to have that expression. So for me, ending up in how it's relative today, so that resistance from as a child, the celebratory part as a child, all this sort of culminated into, when I decided that I'm going to do this for theater. And in the very beginning of this company, 1991, the first half an hour of my hour-and-a-half show, the 10 rows of the audience would get up and walk out. 10. Because we were doing some stuff that they didn't want to hear about. We were doing stuff, you were on racism. We wanted to know where the N-word came from. So we did a whole skit thing about the N-word being like, where does this thing come from? They didn't want to hear it. Of course, back then we were just blatantly going out, blah blah, blah blah. We danced to the Last Poets. Last Poets. If you know the Last Poets work, you either moved or you want to leave, right? You know what I mean, on some of the stuff because it hits right to the heart and the racism and
revolution,
the fiber of this country, and so in the work, I was finding my resistance, and I was dealing, with my resistance within the choreography, which was really very relative to my life. As a child, I remember thinking, "Oh man, I wonder what it'd be like to be white." I bet you, and then as a child, you always heard at that time. I'm not sure what the black community is, where it's at right now, but I remember that you were always being compared. Like if it was a white guy, he would have did this. If it was a white guy, he would have did this. Why are you doing that? And so you always had this kind of comparison. So it was like, what is, it was almost like this, like, well, are they better than us? And should I be that? So all these things were going on in my head as I was growing up. And when I got a chance, by accident, sheer, like, as far as I'm concerned, to do something in the theater, to do whatever I wanted to do, I decided to approach it from hip-hop from that perspective. And the reason why I was able to do it from this sort of raw perspective when I first started is because I was already tired. I had toured, I worked professionally throughout high school with rap artists before they even were touring as filling the Coliseums. And so when I left high school, I went right on the road with the Fresh Festival. Which was my first major gig. It was like Run DMC, Fat Boys, Curtis Blow. LL Cool J was 15 or 14 years old. Jermaine Dupri was 8 or 10 years old at that time. When I finished touring, I was tired. And so I thought I'd seen the world. And I did, in my own way, And so someone called and said, hey, can you do some work in the theater? And I thought it was a joke. And they wanted to pay me a year in advance. And I was like, dude, I might be, this is when they were still shooting on some of the rap tours, like, dude, I might be dead. I might catch, I don't know what, I'm fighting a presenter for my money, you know what I mean? That kind of thing, a promoter. Things were rough. We were coming out, we were in the middle of this sort of crack war, you know what I mean? And we were coming in the middle of it and kind of figuring out where are we going. So things were really raw in the late 80s, early 90s, Public Enemy was spewing their thing, and we were Black Power. We were moving forward as a people.
You're in your early 30s then.
Yeah, well, I'm about 28.
28.
I think, around 27.
So you
28.
get this call.
I get the call, yeah. And he says, I want you to make some work. I'm saying, oh, you want a routine? So we call choreography routines. I didn't even know what work meant. He said, well, I want to commission you. I had never used the word commission in my vocabulary at that point in time. And what you have to understand is I came straight from the neighborhood, right to the stage. I often say I have one foot in the street and one foot on stage. And so my whole world was flipped. And it was like I had a toy. And this is where I began to make the connection and kind of come into the space that I am now. And even in that space, I was still going through processes that saved me and allowed me to move forward the way I should.
Well, trial and error learning, right? You must have experimented a lot.
Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a lot of experimentation. Honestly, the fact that, The hardest thing about choreographing hip hop for theater, number one, is that everything is flat, right? And it's in the box. You're in the box. Number two, the first time we performed for an audience that, when we did this performance actually, that I got commissioned to do, the audience was completely white. I had never, had never. The first time I was, well, I won't say integrated, it was the first time I even like had friends who were white. I was in high school, and the priests in my neighborhood were white. That's about it. And, you know, so I had never, and we were shocked because we were like, well, where are our people? We about, like, where's the hood? And we just was like, oh. So we get out there and we just killing it, bro, just going for it, right? They were quiet. Now we're like, man, you suck. Wait, come on, we gotta dance harder. They're not doing anything, right? And we're arguing, and we're arguing throughout the whole show. On stage, with people, I don't know if they noticed that, maybe they thought it was part of that. But we're arguing, I'm whispering to them, like, come on, man, you should have came to rehearsal, you know, and all that, you know. And yeah, of course now, that's the clean version, because we're actually literally cussing each other out on the stage. And so the end comes, we did the last piece, we did Students of the Asphalt Jungle. You can hear a pin drop. We're lining up to come on the side to go out for the bow. And we had decided, at this particular time, for whatever reason, we started out with 5 women, 3 guys. It was more women than guys. This particular time, there was no women in the crew, in the company. It was just all men for this performance. And so we were backstage making a decision. After this performance, we're going to go outside and we're going to have a rumble. We're going to fight. Because, like, look, Baba, I'm not taking this. You're not going to talk to me like this. I'm a man and blah, 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 blah. We were really having a very strong man moment or young man moment. You know what I mean? And as we're walking out for our bow, and you can still hear people in the line going, wait, you just wait till we get outside. Wait till we, like in high school, like, I'll get you after school, like one of those things. The audience, you heard this roar, like this went, it was just went, and they stood up. We were in shock. We could not believe. We're like, what did we do? Like the whole time you didn't say anything. This was a complete culture shock to us. In our community, we're used to having affirmation in our conversations. You have to go, yes, I know what you're talking about. Yep, you absolutely right. You have, you know what I mean? Yeah, I know what you're saying. You have to have affirmation in the conversation. You must have affirmation when you're expressing yourself. Oh, go ahead and do it. You have to. That's the thing that you get love from every point and attention from every point. This was a whole new experience for us. And so the hardest part was having to refocus hip-hop dancers to not focus on the audience because that was going to mess us up. So we started, especially if we were having predominantly white audiences in the very, very beginning. And so what we did, I started this thing of we're going to perform for us. And so we started to create these little performances on stage.
And with a cipher.
Right, like a cipher, and build our own energy and do tricks and things that like we would surprise each other. So we were dancing, one of the dancers would stop dancing in the middle of the thing and walk in front of the other dancer and do the choreography backwards. And like just to see, like, can you make it? Can you make it? Are you gonna mess up? You're gonna mess up? You know, and we're like cracking up on stage, or one dancer jumps to the edge and does a flip into the audience, completely black, not even knowing that he can't see because there's no light out there. He just flips in. No one sees the flip. We see the flip. They didn't know what happened. But we cracked up. We thought it was the funniest thing. And what I realized was that if you create this cipher of energy, that just like a pebble in a pond, it's just going to ring out. And eventually, by the end of each performance, the audience was with us. They were, you know.
Regardless of race, they'd be interacting with it?
Yeah. Eventually. I mean, we often, if you've known the company for a while, you know we've also had disclaimers and announcements in the beginning. It's okay, this is traditional African culture to call and respond. You can yell and scream during our performance. You know, some people felt it was rude, you know, and theater goers like, oh. You know, but for us, it was like, it made us dance harder. And so as the audience starts to change, we had younger people, and the younger people understood. So you had, we used to look in the audience and say, oh my God, you're so like somebody's grandmom in the front like this. And then some like girl and stuff like, ah! He's like, and we would peep out like, oh my God, did you see that? You know, and so we started to create this sort of diverse audiences nationally when we performed. People who follow us, so kids, you know, the family came out, and even when it was sort of racy and edgy, because again, what we tend to forget about the artist who's sharing his or her work in theater, not necessarily Broadway theater, I'm talking about the fine art or whatever you want to call it, it is their personal journey, and you're looking into their life. It's not about what you want to see, it's about you're looking into what's going on in this person's head. You know, like, wow. You know, it's like watching television, you see some crazy stuff, like, what were they thinking? You know, and so that's the connection, and so that was the interesting part for me. And then slowly, as I got older, I kind of got less. I'm still resistant, but in the work, I'm very clear and I have a different focus now about okay, this for kids. I'm going to push this. I'm going to push that. I'm going to push business. I'm going to push people to speak from a human place, you know what I mean, to be from their heart and follow the three laws of hip hop, which was individuality, creativity, and innovation. We must always be moving forward. We must always represent ourselves as an individual, and we always have to be creative about how we do things. We can barely come out with the same clothes the next day. You know, we can't wear it. I couldn't wear it. I do, but now I do. Like, I couldn't, like, if I was in my neighborhood, I get talked about, like, yeah, he said, Rennie, he had them pants on yesterday. Well, you know, my dancers talk about me now, but I don't care. You know, it makes a difference. You know, that comes with age, like, humbug.
So you're talking about innovation day to day?
No, minute to minute.
Minute to minute.
I had resistance in the company of dancers who didn't want to do choreography, certain movement, because it was not current. And I said, if you limit hip hop that way, then no, we cannot have hip hop as a concert dance form, because now you're shutting down the vocabulary. The vocabulary it spans like all the way from the Lindy Hop and from African dance all the way through all these movements, and if you cut all of that off and you're just talking about we're going to do Walk It Out. Now, how long can you do that? You know what I mean? You know, you done run through all the current dances in 15 minutes. You know, but you have to reach into the wealth of knowledge and the history. And so that was the importance for me to go back and research, because, you know, I couldn't move forward. Like, no house can be built without foundation.
Before going back, and one thing about innovation too, then you talked about the fact that when you do a choreography, it can change. So you allow the space, and how does that work? I mean, today as a
right. Well, I think that's the key for hip hop dance and as concert dance. And today we have this painted this picture of hip hop as this sort of regimented, very lyrical and very structured, and that's jazz, that's isolation jazz. There's nothing hip hop about it other than people's projected attitude, right? But for hip hop, when you see a hip hop dance company, hip hop dancers are like jazz musicians. None of them are the same. They will have different variations on top of variations, like tappers do. And so when you watch them dance, we're all moving the same rhythm, but our application is completely different, right? And when you allow that, you allow for brilliant moments to happen. So the work always has to breathe. 2 years, or like maybe a year or a month go by, I'll go back and say, that's not the choreography. That's not what I choreographed, and I'll pull it back, and then they'll breathe it again and change it. I get upset, but the truth of the matter is it has to breathe. If it doesn't breathe, then it's not hip-hop. It doesn't change, it's not hip-hop.
Well, and that's the individuality part, too.
Right. They have to contribute. That's their contribution to the work. Like if I was to say, I only want this and this and this here, but that's a dictatorship. And I don't see any, I mean, that doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for hip-hop. You know, when you begin, I mean, in the way I'm defining it, but and on some level, this sort of definition of a structure is not, you know, it's structure with flexibility.
Sure.
And we spoke about this earlier. It is, hip hop understands that structure is not a guideline, it's a guideline. And that we can fall off the path. We may not get back on it. That may actually be okay. But the idea is that we would like to get back on the path and go straight.
And you'll never get back on it in the same place.
And exactly, because no one does the same thing the same way any day. Everything you do, you think well, that person does this every day the same way. No, he doesn't. No, she doesn't. We go to work differently. You know, we may do the same things, but our application on how we do it is completely different. Our whole lives are improvisational. And which surprises me when people, oh, I had this plan, and it went out the window, and they stressed out, and they had a heart attack. All right, you know, it went out the window, except the fact there's nothing you could do about it. It's gone. Get a new plan.
I've never heard a life story that went according to plan.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about your life story, Harry, because you've been in the arts your whole life, and your brother became an artist, and this created a certain amount of concern for you when he was on the verge of this. He'd been to Morehouse College, he was in graduate school at the Fashion Institute of Technology in Manhattan, and then what is he? He calls you up, or how do you hear that he's going to launch himself?
I think I was in New York, whatever, yeah. So his path was not from the streets, but he became of the streets, which I think was part of, you know, a part of hip hop for him, and I think a part of hip hop, period. But so yeah, my brother told me that was in New York, and he was dropping out of the Fashion Institute of Technology to, you know, become a MC. Like, what are you, crazy? You know, you can't do this. You got to get a job. You've been to college. You need a graduate degree. Get grips. And what I learned from my brother was that that sense, the same sense with you, that you can make a dream a reality, and that if you got this dream as an artist, that sense that you have to follow it, that you literally have to be a junkie for this dream because you're going to make it work. And that's in a sense what and he had hard times at first in terms of being an artist. At his memorial service in Boston, one of his early partners told two stories that were interesting in terms of my brother. The first one was that they had, they basically had, he was living with his partner who was the DJ Premier, the DJ, and they were so poor they had nothing, but my brother had a job, but he had nothing to wear to the job, so he wore Premier's clothes, and Premier's like 3 times larger than him, and so underneath his clothes he put sweats so he could wear Premier's clothes to work that day. And later, back in Boston, because my father was a judge in Boston and the first black director of the Boston Municipal Court, and an important influence on all of us. So my brother wanted to convince my father that this was the right career for him. And so he and his partner had to put on a concert for my father and mother in the living room. And Suge, who was telling this story, he said, he's performed all over the world, but he's never been as nervous. That was like, and my brother afterwards said, "Thank you, man, thank you." And so, that gave my parents actually are in a video of my brother's called X-Girl to Next Girl. So seeing your parents on MTV was like,
you seeing your parents?
Yeah, it was very different, but I guess for me, back in '93, he played here. He played at Dinkelspiel, and before that, being known on campus as Professor Elam, I was just the guru's brother. As I walked into the space, that's the guru's brother. It's like so that became my claim to fame, that I was related to him. He wasn't my little brother anymore. And so I think that one, like you, he had a real sense and belief in the power of hip hop and what it could do in terms of not just as a form of art, but as a form of social change, movement, expression, dynamic, nation building in a sense all behind it. And,
I read somewhere he spent a little time as a social worker.
Yeah, that was when he was dressed up in his roommate's clothing to get to work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because his work, he has a real concern for educating people in his work.
And I think that's, a part of hip hop has got to be the message, you know, and how you're delivering that message. And I think for him, part of that influence, he claimed New York as home rather than Boston, and part of that was his experience and the hardness you said that you faced in terms of the streets in New York. At the same time, part of it also for him was the fact that when he decided to do this, my mother, who was the head of the libraries in the School of Boston, gave him, a book of poetry and rhymes and that sense of lesson that you should, so that sense of being connected to a history, a black history, a history of what it meant in terms of struggle, resistance, survival, and all of those things, were important to him in terms of creating music in and around what he did. So, yeah.
When was the turning point for you in regards to? He auditioned for your mom and your pop.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
How did you?
Before I taught at Stanford, I taught it by then at in the 80s. I was teaching at the University of Maryland in College Park. And he came down there to me and played some of his stuff. And I was directing a play, and he had done this demo at that point. And we put it on, at the cast party. And people were like jamming to his music. It's like, I'm dancing to my brother.
That's a turning point.
And so, yeah, the sense that he was doing something and that had a sound and also the realization for me that hip hop was not going anywhere, or rap wasn't, as a form. So then Jazzmatazz happened, soon thereafter, and that was. If you've ever seen the movie More Better Blues, Spike Lee's movie, there's a song at the end called Jazz Thing, and that was my brother's song at the end, and that sort of launched things. And then, seeing him on The Tonight Show, doing rap music on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno was kind of cool. So all of these things, and seeing him perform all over the world, basically. And one of the things I was going to ask you about that, thinking about that, why do you think hip hop has had this kind of global growth? What made it so that people in Latvia, would be?
Right. Well, it's. Let me first say, just to say, his brother's an icon in hip hop, basically. You know what I mean? So if you don't know, really, get the album, look him up, so I'm interested in the story of that connection, cause my brothers look at me and go so what are you doing? You're not dancing in the video? But they don't get that I have a company and I dance for myself, and people come to see us, and so they still don't really kind of get it. So for me, I'm interested in that story of the realization of this is real, this is these moments and what have you. But the why part, I believe that it is this, it's funny, the same spirit with a different name. And that from rhythm and blues, rock and roll, jazz, bebop, all these different genres of music represented a generation, a youth, and they moved on, and they felt freedom, and they felt alive, and that this spirit comes back in the music. And I say music because sound to me is the voice of God in many ways. And so the music, this sound, this voice of God continues to tell us with each generation that you have freedom and that you have choice and that you have options. You have your soul to be individual. You can do all these things and not to be limited. So I think it feels like the same spirit with each generation. A different style that ignites the youth into resistance and to feeling alive and to moving forward. And then historically, if you go back and you research, Rock and roll, there were riots. People were killed over rock and roll. They were killed over rhythm and blues because it was all the devil's music. They were killed over jazz. Jazz meant to fornicate, so did rock and roll meant to fornicate back in the day. That was the original term, euphemism that it was used for. In regards to hip hop was no different than rock and roll and funk. It was just a new generation, the same spirit saying you're free, you have choice, you're not limited, and then it comes back. Not only does it come back, and says this internally to the youth, but it says it as a movement. The term hip has been defined as deriving from the word hippie. Dr. Geneva Smitherman, who wrote the book Black Talk, defines this word hippie as coming from a Wolof language spoken in West Africa that I know of, called Wolof, which means to open your eyes or to reopen your eyes. So the idea of hip means to be knowledgeable, to know who you are as a spirit on this planet, to know why you are here, that you're here to learn how to love, because basically it's all about loving each other. Everything we do is about loving each other. We lie to people because we want them to think of us as being great all the time so they can love us all the time. You know what I mean? We lie to people because we don't want to hurt nobody's feelings so they can treat us mean and then they don't love us anymore. You got me? Everything we do that involves another person is based around some form of wanting to be loved. And because we're here in this sort of path of trying to figure out the idea of it and get back to the actual ultimate love in that way. And I think hip hop is an extension of all those different genres. And even if we're talking about Mozart, we're talking about Shakespeare. People at his time weren't feeling these cats at some point too. Shakespeare, they just sort of kind of feeling this cat. You know what I mean? Like, he was writing his stuff in the bar and his little lounge for his homies and stuff. You know what I mean? So you got me. He innovated the language. He was the stuff that when I was reading Shakespeare, I was like, man, it's like a gangster rapper. You know what I mean? Because he was saying some stuff. I was like, whoa. Strumpets and all kinds. I was like, what? And so we go through each genre with this. Of course, we get older, and then all of a sudden we forget that we were young. We forget that we were rebelling, and we forget these things for whatever reason. And so part of my thing is to make sure that we don't forget in hip hop, and I think that's what it is. And I think that's why this thing has become global, the way jazz had become global, the way rock and roll became global. Because these are like, I'm not going to let you forget that you're free, you have choice. And that's my personal belief from a spiritual place, that why it has moved the way that it's moved across and affected so many. You've seen it, I've seen it. When the first time we went to overseas and saw, Japanese lockers and poppers and rappers with locks and it's amazing, and Russian poppers and African break dancers and like, you're like, what is going on? Yeah. When there was only in a 5-block radius in your neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like, and now, and so I think, so I'm interested also too, just that process for you as it goes and becomes this global thing, especially when it's, when you're like, okay, well, make me understand this. Why would you want to do this? And then that process, and a couple of things. One, for me, and seeing him and what he did with jazz. So my brother has been credited with sort of bringing jazz and hip hop together as an innovator in terms of that jazzman thing that I mentioned. And the sense of jazz, Mataz, he made these albums with jazz musicians, guys who I admired. Like, damn, my brother's singing with, Roy Ayers and whatever, and Donald Byrd. And so it was just amazing connection. So I got to meet them through him. There was that part of it. And also the sense of the global reach. I was teaching for Stanford and Oxford, and my brother was in London.
You know, and I went to hear him there, to see him recording there. And seeing that sense of, yes, people reacting to the music, getting into it, as you said, and in his passing, the internet being what it is and people being able to find me at Stanford. I've heard from people all over the world about something else you mentioned, and that is the sense of spirit. The sense that that his music touched them in a way and impacted their life and changed them, and that they felt like they had to share this with me. You know, it was heartwarming for me, for my family who I shared them with, and that sense that you talked about, that yes, that art can have that power, you know, in people's life to impact them in ways that change. And yeah, there's the connection, as you said, to youth, to that power. And the idea of it as a movement's been interesting for me too, being an academic, because now I've written about and studied, you know, hip hop as you know, as a scholar, and been to conferences in Europe where people are talking about Polish hip hop, people are talking about hip hop in Germany done by, and that sense that I mentioned before of resistance, you know, that it's a way to give voice to the voiceless,
right,
you know,
right,
in a variety of different ways, remains, you know, so you see, regardless, that people find that hip hop has that power to do that. I mean, yeah, you can say that rap's been co-opted in ways and commercialized, and I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, let's talk about the commercialization of dissent and go back to this experience that you're talking about. Yeah, this is just starting out in your neighborhood. This movement just takes off. You can find it everywhere. Where is that spirit now? And as you know, here in the United States, right? Or where is hip hop really happening now? And I was thinking about, so the spirit moves and it takes on the characteristics of the local culture each place. And you might say that the local culture in the United States is get rich or die trying. And if hip hop seems to reflect that spirit, is that where we are right now?
Well, you know, there's a twofold thing. I remember we talked about the negative and positive. One thing about, specifically, I'm going to say hip hop, I'm going to say the black community, that from my experience in the black community, there was always this sense of the idea that we live one day at a time. And when I say, I mean, we all hear that, but I mean, it's in the language of black folk. You know what I mean? Oh, how you doing, man? Man, I'm just trying to make it to the end of the day. You know, everything they say is always just about that particular moment. And so the idea of hip hop really is about living within the moment that exists. And so for them, I have $100,000. I'm going to go out there and buy me a big ass. I'm sorry.
Quite all right.
Oh, y'all caught me. This was my week of not cursing. That's what I told my students today. I was not going to curse all week. All right.
Have you been walking around campus?
Exactly. But I'm going to buy me a big chain, and I'm going to live now. So we couldn't understand. My mom didn't understand why I had on like $5 jeans and like $100 shoes. Like, and why I would spend up $100 on my shoes when I was 15 years old. You know, because I needed to have it now. And so the idea of I'm going to live now because tomorrow is not promised to us is very, in a way, is very spiritual to me. Now, I'm not saying that this is not an excuse for what's happening today, because some of them are just out of their minds. You know what I mean? But on some level, I understand it as well, because the community, that's what the community was very much like. It's about living for today and not worrying about tomorrow. Because when you're poor, you're living day by day. When you're poor, you go to the store that day, you get the food that you're going to cook that night, and then you use it. We didn't have a refrigerator. We didn't have furniture. We had crates in my house. You know, my mom put stuff on them, and, you know, people thought we had a funky house, but, you know, it was crates under there, milk crates, when they made them out of iron at that time. You know what I mean? In the winter, in the summertime, we made the food for that day. We ate. Wintertime, the food went out on the back step. You know, so the idea of living for that day to day was very, to me, I think was the jump off point, connection with hip hop in that way about, you know, the overspending and or at least the idea of it and the bling bling. And I think there's a small contribution. The rest of them just being young and just dumb, maybe. But but today's hip hop, like you said, is co-opted and.
Do you differentiate hip hop from rap? I mean, the commercialization
No, actually,
of
I
it
don't.
or not?
I don't. When someone said that to me, so what do you think about rap? What do you think about rap and hip hop? Which one do you like? And I was like, huh? And I remember I was at UCLA, I was teaching UCLA, and I was like, huh? Like, what? This a trick question? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I didn't know. I was like, well, it's the same thing to me. You know what I mean? So, like, the hip hop is the culture. You know what I mean? MCing and rapping, I think are actually, if you said the difference between MCing and rapping, that's clearer to me because the MC is about the party, like getting everybody involved, throw your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care. The rapper is the modern day griot, the jolly, what they say in Africa, the jolly, the person who tells the story of the people, the person who remembers the history of the people, the person that always sees everything. That's the rapper. He's the storyteller to me. And then there's the MC. But when you say hip hop and rapper, it's the same, one and the same to me. But I think, today is a whole new different brand of hip hop. A very new, and I often I had to stop myself from talking down about it and realize that I was doing the very thing I was fighting. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, that's not hip hop. You go to the hip hop jail. You know what I mean? Like, and then I realized, and once I realized this, it became very clear that in the United States, black, white, or indifferent, we are very elitist about our hip hop. We want to see it how we understand it. We want to see it because it's a street dance, so therefore it belongs in the street. We want to see people flipping over top of each other's head. We want to see like the hands, the rapper hands, the pants down to our kneecaps. You know what I mean? Everywhere else, they're pushing the envelope in places that I've seen. And I'm not saying that it's not happening here, because it is happening in the States, but I'm saying in general. If you're not flipping over someone or doing a super fast rhyme, or if the rhyme is not about sex, if the rhyme is not about killing someone, then it's not hip hop. And that, my friend, is not what I remember as being hip hop from the very beginning. Hip hop was inclusive of everything. It may have had a little sex appeal, it had a little, man moment at sometimes, but it was very much about acknowledging self and being proud of self. One of the things, I'm the best. It was, I'm confident, being very confident about what you do and how amazing you are, and no one loves you but you. And this, again, when you're coming from poverty, that's all you have is your confidence. You know what I mean? Like, I'm the best, sure I can do it. You know what I mean? And so that's the foundation of hip hop. And I think today we moved away from that. Now as a product, and I'm just finish up with this crazy thing in the store, in a dollar store in LA. I turn around, I'm walking down the aisle. Actually, my girlfriend likes to go to these dollar stores for whatever reason. All right, I need to tell you that was too much information. But so basically, I'm bored. I don't like to shop, but I get somehow like, come shopping. So I'm walking around, my feet hurt, my back hurt. I'm like, are you done, right? So I'm like, and that's another story. I can do a whole lecture on men and shopping. I just want to let y'all know that. Some things, women, you might want to know. All right? Now, anyway, how to get the best out of it. Anyway, so I turn around at that moment. It's like, all right, I'm hot. I need to go. And I look over, and there was a packet of tights, pink tights, and had a ballet dancer on it. And in bold black, it said, hip-hop tights. On the ballet dancer with a tutu, and she's doing this, and I was like, you have to be kidding me. Like, are you kidding me? Like, you stamp it hip-hop, they will come. By virtue of me drinking this water, this is now hip-hop water, and I ask you all to buy this. We sort of eased into the idea, and in some way, I remember capitalism was an extremely bad word. Now it's completely is the fiber of this country. I mean, it's always been, but we've sort of accepted it as this American culture or capitalism.
Could you put your dancers in hip hop tights?
No. Well, I will tell you one thing. Let me tell you how conditioned I was in some level from the dance part. One time I attempted to have the dancers go, I said, look, we're going to take our shoes off. You know, because the modern dancers they were bare feet. And so we were going to do hip hop with bare feet. I'm like, yeah, you know, and those dancers like, Rennie, you are tripping. We're not, their feet were hurting so bad, and they were like, man, and it was funny thing, guys said, man, we have hip-hop feet, dude. Hip-hop feet have to be protected. You know, we're not like these other cats. And then at that moment, I was like, oh man, I was getting assimilated. I was becoming, and when I was in the theater, I was trying to be like everyone else. And I caught myself like, oh, hold up back, I have to keep this hip hop, and how can I do it, and how can I do it tastefully? How can I do it for us in a way that, you know, that creates some sort of methodology of how to choreograph for the theater in that way. So I watch myself, like when I start to feel that moment, like, you know, because I'm a musical baby. I like musicals and Ziegfeld Follies. I grew up, you know, like late at night like this, looking at the television, and so I can easily move into that space very easily in that way because of that. But I think we as a culture have kind of moved there now, that now this sort of like Broadway culture, this can you think, so you think you can dance, this television culture has kind of defined how we see hip hop now, how we see anything that's street, from the skateboarders to whatever, they grab it, they take it, they repackage it, they put it back out. You know, I just find it interesting that the word media begins with MED for medicinal. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's what's happening with our culture.
Let's talk a little bit about that before we open up to audience questions. So we'll talk a little bit more about this point just made, but think about your questions, and then we'll have time. Yeah, so how do you subvert the media?
I used to write letters.
I mean, as an artist, what are you going to do next?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What are you going to do as an artist next to subvert this? I mean, I think, haven't the media taken control of hip-hop, and can hip-hop get it back?
A related question to that, too. Has your choreography changed?
Oh, I think my choreography has changed dramatically. I think, you know, just the way that I think about it from a more complex place rather than a more, when I first started, it was about simple movement, and it was about the aesthetic, and all my original dancers, their spirit and their characters that they created on stage is what drove the work. Now I feel like the choreography itself is driving the work, not just the dancer pushing it, you know what I mean? But I think,
Do you have some new moves coming up?
I mean, I think, you know, I'm interested, as I'm doing the work I'm working on is called Heaven. This piece called Heaven, I'm premiering in Philadelphia. It is I'm calling it a B-girl ballet, using predominantly all female, 3 boys and the rest are all female breakers, and is based loosely off of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring.
Right.
And I wrote this story that I made up about the grandfather and the grandmother, and the young woman is telling the story of the grandmother and the grandfather, about how the grandfather was so obsessed with going to heaven, the grandmother killed him so he can go. And so this is sort of, do not just try this at home. And so the story is, really the underbelly of the story is our men, our obsession with sex. The whole idea of like this, you know, like what is that? Like what is this relationship? And how we separate the two things. The relationship and sex are two different things in the relationship. And for my experience, for my relationships, the relationship and sex all was intertwined. So if I messed up the relationship, sex was not happening. But for a guy that made, you know, and I'm gonna say making love the whole night. So this is all based on relationships, and so the idea of heaven, like this obsession, what is going on? So basically, so that's the undercurrent of it, and so she kills him so that he can actually experience it, you know. And so the story is her crew of women. They sort of like a Midnight Summer's Dream, where they kind of seduce him and create these illusions for him and whatever to, you know, to get him, and then they sort of sacrifice him to the gods and so, what have you. So now I know that's kind of crazy, but that's some stuff I was just like, oh, this would be hot, you know. And again, remember, you go and you're looking into the minds of the artists when you go to see work in this fashion, right? The other work I'm working on is called 100 Naked Locks, about the last 100 humans in the universe. The world blows up, of course, and then there are 3 people left, the Father, Son, and they're
So it's kind of sci-fi.
Yes, sci-fi is a hip-hop sci-fi, and the 3 people who are left are African Bambaataa, DJ Kool Herc, and Grandmaster Flash, and they become celestial beings, and they run the whole universe. And then Nas is running for president, and he's fighting with Jay-Z, and so the universe of hip hop and all the different planets of hip hop begin to fight each other. The Trinity decides that they had like 1,000 years of peace, and they're making the decision like, well, what do we do? How do we get peace again? And then someone makes a decision. We need to basically kill everybody and start all over again. And so, yeah, we need the pink tights. Now, if I get those pink tights, I'm gonna have more crazy ideas. So, real quick story. I'm making a hip hop sci-fi based on like the madness and craziness in the hip hop world, sort of like, you know, just a play on the hip hop world of what's happening, you know, with the fight, the infighting, and the murder, you know, and Biggie and Tupac are the 2 icons who, the 2 factions in this universe are sided with Biggie and Tupac. Yeah, so I'm working on that. So my work, I feel like now I'm not just telling my story. My work originally was telling my personal story about my family, my life, and those things. Now I feel like my work is sort of, I feel like I'm just looking outside of myself and looking a little bit more universal in a way, and looking for those inspirations, and whether they become great pieces or what have you. I'm not necessarily, you know, worried about it, other than this is the one thing that I actually have fun at, is the creation part. Everything else I don't necessarily like, but I like the actual creation part. And the last thing, because I heard them say, I heard y'all thinking over here, I'm doing a piece, a full night or a 45-minute piece to Queen. Yeah, all of Queen's work that I like. And so I'm creating sort of like what I'm calling a dance musical, where it's really, they're not singing, but the Queen's music was like they were storytelling, telling these amazing. You can just visually see this stuff, and so I'm sort of connecting different songs, so it actually begins to tell this little longer story throughout the night. So those are the 3 works I'm currently working on.
What about your dancers come from certain tradition, right? What has it been like to put dance on like other companies, like Alvin Ailey? What was it like to bring your dance to them?
Yeah, well, here's I mean, it was a learning experience for me. I had a chance to work with a few dancers. I mean, dancers, Alvin Ailey, DC, and Memphis Ballet, and all of these dance companies. The issue becomes, what was interesting to me is that, and here's where I can, maybe you can ask me and tell me what your thoughts are. I'm a hip hop dancer. I know no ballet. I know terms to make connection, but I haven't, you know, taken no classes in ballet to say I'm a ballet dancer or a modern dancer or even an African dancer, right? Or even Lindy Hop. So as a hip hop dancer and you're a ballet dancer or a modern dancer, I give you this hip hop movement. What happens is that your language dominates my language. So it's like speaking Spanish with an English grammatical structure, right? And so my job then becomes to get rid of your accent.
Is it possible?
It's possible if you took a language course when you were, my daughter took language when she was 3 and 4, and then you remember it after years later. Like, so if you had the experience, you've seen it or been around it on some level, or just walked around it, you may actually resource it as a, you know, subconsciously and bring it back up and make the connection. But what happens is, you know, especially with what the dancers who are trained in modern ballet, they're you know, what we call muscle memory. Their muscles muscles are speaking the language of a language they've been training for years. So if I tell them to do this, they're doing this. You know, if I'm like, do that, they're like, you know, and their response is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Right? So it's having to teach them and love the language in a very, very short time. And so that part is interesting for me. The result becomes something else. I don't necessarily know if it's a hip-hop piece. After I'm done, it may just be a piece by Rennie Harris. Right. You know what I mean? Rather than that's hip-hop inspired, because their language is going to dominate it so much that you're really just going to see a lot of their language and a little bit of, and I become the accent.
Interesting.
Fascinating.
Other questions? Yes. Please.
I guess this question is directed to both speakers on stage. I know you guys both have a lot of background in academia and hip hop and whatnot, and I was just wondering, as a dancer myself, and going around and trying to document breaking, it's really hard to get just an objective view, because I start talking and then they're like, no, that's wrong because Rocksteady said this, or no, that's wrong because, you know, like the OG said this. Like, how do you record or document a culture where it's so like politicized, and how do you, is there a way to go about it with, and still keeping the integrity of the dancer, their views, your views, and like making it work for the audience as well?
I found, you know, I've documented, and most, of pioneers that I know who work with me or come to Philadelphia, what have you, we always document and videotape and what have you. And because I teach it and I lecture about it, what I found the easiest way as a documenter, to get this information is tell the information of that particular person. So for instance, if Rocksteady says, well, actually the windmill was created by Crazy Legs because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, boom. And then you have New York City Breakers say, well, actually, no, the windmill might have been, I think it was this guy. Tell both of the stories. It's not about, because when you're looking at hip hop, you can't or you shouldn't look at hip hop in this sort of linear way. Because there is no linear, it's all these other complexities and languages, and it's just very complex, and they're all layered. Because when you think about it, hip-hop is indigenous to its person, its place, its thing. Like, so if we stayed in this theater, we become the hip-hop crew from Stanford right here in the Forum. This is the Forum hip-hop crew. And we stay here for 2 months. We create our own movement, our own style, our own talk, right? Hip-hop is regional, so most people have their own story about how it went down. And if you're trying to find out the actual person, that's like trying to find a person who actually, you know, the first cat who put on taps and said, okay, this is tapping. You know, you may not find that, but what you want to do is draw out the innovators, draw out the history as we know it at large, you know what I mean? And all those other stories that just come out, and just let it be, because their voice and their version of it is important. And what's going to happen is, when you put all of those stories together, you'll start to see this line. Because a lot of times they're telling you stuff, but they're forgetting to tell you this other thing, which this is connected to this, which may be connected to New York City Breakers. And the reason why some of the New York City Breakers actually dance in the Rocksteady crew. And the Rocksteady crew dancers, a lot of them danced in New York City Breakers. Now these dancers were going back and forth from the Ghetto Originals to, you know, the Crazy Commanders and what have you. So you have all of them sort of like dancing for each other throughout history. So all these stories are slightly different, but you will find those to be the same. And I think Raphael, one of our alumni dancers, is also too, can give you, I'm just putting you on the spot, can tell you some stuff about that, because you're going to hear different stories. But but I always felt it was safe just to say breaking, b-boying really originated from the gang culture. That's the truth. Nobody can say they didn't. B-Boy Spy was the man with 1,000 moves, was the one who really innovated the vocabulary of breaking. So most of the vocabulary in the beginning, a lot of that came from the Crazy Commanders, of which he was a part of. You know, so all those major, like, pull those out and then let all them other little stories happen. And that's how it was easier for me not to try to get the truth, but get their truth.
I really don't have anything to. I would just say, from the first time I heard Rennie talk about the history of hip-hop dancing, I loved hearing him talk about that history, because what you have done is given it structure, you know, the moves and legitimacy, that people have denied that in a sense, but it has that, and you undoubtedly know that as a dancer. But I also love your point that it's not a linear history, that there were explosions at different points, at different places. And I think, you know, scholars, critics, people talking about that history have to realize, we often try to put it in a neat narrative, that this happened, which led to this, and happened to that. But I think thinking of that sense of those explosions happening differently and feeding each other, yes, in ways, but also, yes, developing separately is what makes it such an incredible form.
And the other part to it is, think of it, attempt to think of it as don't think of it from a Western point of view, a Eurocentric point of view, where everything, like there's a history and it's written down. This is not that. Our story is this whole other story in many cultures. But if you're following like, okay, we're going to write the history, remember the history is always his story. You know what I mean? So that you're still following that thing is going to come out. I wanted to, Raphael, could you say something on that about those stories being different? And because Raphael's done a little bit himself.
I have an interesting dynamic on it because I know a lot of those guys personally. So I hear what one person says, and I'm going, yeah, but that doesn't work for this person. And I think one of the main things that Rennie said, it's definitely regional, because I'm not going to say any names, but you know these people if I say their names. You have someone who was raised in the Bronx. You have another person who's from Manhattan. The dude from the Bronx is the one credited for a specific movement, a specific style, or the movement period, right? But he's never met this guy in Manhattan, and Manhattan never met the Bronx. So this dude from the Bronx just so happens to travel and meet this dude halfway, right? But this guy in Manhattan will outdo the dude from the Bronx. But the dude from the Bronx now becomes the guy on television, in the media, and this is his word now is the word. So now you have beef with this person and this person, but they're in the same crew. So
Right.
how I see things is, I'm not a biased person when it comes to this, because I know them personally and it makes sense to me. But at one point, I would take the word of so-and-so and go, okay, cool, that's what it is. And then I hear this person go, wait a minute, that's not right. But Rennie, one of the most important things that he says all the time is, don't take my word, don't listen to me and take my word for it. Find out what it is for yourself and define it. I think that's one of the most profound things for hip-hop, anyone in hip-hop, because that's when it makes sense. None of this stuff now makes sense until you make sense for yourself. You know what I mean?
Like drawing out that story, what is it that you want to say? You know what I mean? And then figure that out, you know, because you're telling the history, you can get that and figure that out, but what are you what's your take on it? Think of it as your thesis. What are how are you going to, what's your view? Maybe it's the story of that particular person and its family. You know what I mean? And those are, it's about that world. You know what I mean? Kind of like what was an amazing film, I thought, if you get a chance to watch this film is called, was it B-Boy Planet? I thought B-Boy, did you see it? Yeah, I thought it was amazing, just the whole idea that they follow these crews and follow these certain families and went into the families, and the families are crying, and then the fathers are upset. Why are you even doing this? Like, what is wrong with you, you know? And the son wanted to live up to his father, to show his father, like, it's moving. So if you get a chance to see this movie, but that was a different take to me. When I first heard it, they was like, you know, oh, B-Boy. I'm like, B-Boy Planet. You know, when I saw it, I was like, that's hip hop, because it told the stories of everybody. Yeah.
Yes.
and Dr. Harris. What are your thoughts on contemporary Black gospel praise and worship music as that has definitely gotten a hold of rap, been seen DJing as a vehicle to communicate love? I'm thinking of like Richie Righteous and Mary, Super Friend. So
You can go back to earlier too. What's his name? Franklin?
Kurt Franklin.
Kurt Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
well, Kurt Carr,
Mm-hmm.
Kurt Carr. So that is an area of innovation in the hip hop music, because that's what gets my attention. Not so much that message of love is important, but also just as a source of innovation in music. Period. Because the stuff my kids listen to like is so lame. I can't stand it. I need something fresh. I do want those choices, and I'm hearing it and finding it in the contemporary Black spiritual music.
Yeah, I love the. What you think. For me, just a quick comment. I think that's great. And what I would say, I would connect it actually back, and think about jazz, blues in relationship to Black spiritual music. Then, there's this wonderful scene in The Great Debaters at the beginning, the movie that Denzel Washington directed, and there's this song that's playing, and it plays both in this bar and in a revival meeting. You know, and that's the sense that music had that kind of duality in Black life from, I would say, basically, you know, from the beginning, and how people understood it, and even that practice now. And I mean, going through the years of what instruments people allowed in church, said, you know, you can't do that. Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, this to me is the next evolution of that, to see how hip hop sound has come into the church.
I love it. I think it was great. You know what I mean? I'm like, because I remember when they didn't want it in the church. I remember when they told us, y'all did the hippity hoppity stuff, and you know what I mean? Like, you know, you need to go to church, and you know, and they didn't want it. I remember, and I said, what are you talking about? This is the most spiritual thing you ever want to hear. You just listen to these people rap. Listen to this guy say what he's saying. And at that time, people were rhyming about God. People were rhyming about life and struggle, and this, to me, was the church, from my perspective of it, you know. And so I think it's amazing, and I'm like, yes, finally, like, you know, there's like this gospel hip hop, this gospel rap, you know, because you know what it is, the changing of regards also happened. The younger kids who became preachers from my generation, because a lot of my cats who are pioneers in Philadelphia are preachers now, and they get up and pop for their congregation while they're preaching. You know, and the young kids love it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you know, and it's a tool to say, listen, we're all children of God. No matter what style of music, you can listen to whatever you listen to, Philip Glass or whatever it is your thing is. That's, to me, music is always God speaking, you know, on whatever level in that way. So I think it's amazing, and I think it's great, and I think that I'm waiting for. I often, you know, they're going to kill me, not really kill me, but I thought about having a gospel dance company, like to dance only to gospel, to, you know, for hip hop though. You know what I mean? You know, I have too many projects, but look at my company manager over here is like, oh man, what this boy? You know, and I think it's amazing, and it needs it, because hip hop was always and is spiritual to me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm gonna give you a little sample why I say this, because I feel like there was always an encoded message from the first rap song that got on the air from Rapper's Delight, and it said, "To the hip, to the hop, you don't stop rocking." All right? To the hip people in the know, the hop, the dance, you know, to the hip people, you don't stop rocking. Rocking was a euphemism for having sex. Don't stop procreating. So it's to the hip to the hop, you don't stop rocking. Up jump to hip to hop, you don't stop rocking. Up jump to boogie, to the bang bang, to the boogie, the rhythm, the beat. Right? So up jump to boogie, the boogie being the spirit of God. Boogie, boogalosa, means spook, but it's really spirit. So up jump to boogie, to the bang bang being in the drum, to the boogie to beat, to the spirit that exists. And so, and on some level, there was a sort of encoded message, you know, from the first hip hop song that hit the airwaves, like, this is about God. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a really beautiful place to end. And thank you very much, Professor Elam, Dr. Harris. We'll see you at the performances on Saturday.
I should mention one thing just from the introduction. I because of my job of being vice provost, I am not the director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts, and that is Sami Alim, and Sami was the person who's now the director, and brought Rennie this time around. So that Sami needs his proper due in terms of that.
Yes, he does. Well, thanks, everyone. The Aurora Forum is presented by Stanford Lively Arts and the Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts, and is co-sponsored by the Office of the President and Provost and Stanford's Office of Public Affairs. The Aurora Forum is produced by Mark Gonnerman. If you have questions or comments about this or other Aurora Forum programs, contact auroraforum@stanford.edu.